As best I can understand it, Dr. Jordan Peterson's view is that there's no way to know if God exists, or even if Christianity is really true. He even goes so far as to say that the Bible isn't clear on whether or not the resurrection happened. So if you're done having a fantastic laugh, let's investigate his point of view. Dr. Peterson claims that he's a Christian not because the Bible's true, but rather because it's psychologically beneficial. Now, I disagree. And I want to take the time to give you a few examples of huge psychological benefits that are simply not possible if God does not exist, but that are possible if God does exist, where, in other words, it does matter if it's true psychologically, which is where he's taking a look at this. So let's just start with the first. Here's a list of what we're going to go through. Just basic personal honesty and sanity. Seems like a psychological benefit to have personal honesty and sanity. Anxiety and worry. The question of life after death. The question of the temptations of pleasure that we all face. The question of pride and how to deal with pride. And then overcoming our inner struggle to be good instead of bad. Just how to overcome that inner struggle. So we're going to take a look at those. Now, the first one is God actually exists. We have proof that God actually exists. You can prove that God actually exists. Take a look on my channel on the playlist, Proof God Exists. Although you can go to the classical proofs and just take the time to understand them. They may take a little bit of thinking, but I should have it all covered there for you. Now here's the point. If it is clear that God does actually exist, then does it help you psychologically to be honest about that? In other words, if you are dishonest and in denial about something that is clearly and obviously true, is that bad for you psychologically? So, I mean, this is almost a rhetorical question at this point. There's no point in me even talking about this any further. It's so obvious. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next thing. Heaven and hell. You know, the afterlife. Life after death. Here's a question. Will anything I do ultimately be forgotten in a few short generations? On Dr. Jordan Peterson's view, yes. Everything, your entire existence will be forgotten. So my question is it a psychological benefit to know that someone out there pays attention to the things you have done, and that the things you have done will always be meaningful to that someone? Does it make you feel, in other words, if you were to think that in a few generations no one will ever remember you existed, does that make you feel like your life is pointless? Okay, so is there a psychological benefit to know that someone pays attention to your existence forever, and that there will be someone who always cares that you lived? It's almost rhetorically obvious at this point. Now let's look at another one. The question of anxiety and worry and fear. You know, these are all psychological problems that we face. Okay. Now, the biblical answer goes something like this. It says, Luke 12:29, it says, "Do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek His kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." In other words, the biblical answer is that God's looking out for you and has a plan for your life. So, here's the question. If God doesn't actually exist and isn't actually looking out for you, then be afraid. Be very afraid. Who knows what might happen? But if God's looking out for you, then don't be afraid. And even if something bad happens, God had a plan for it. And your job is to obey God, to do the things that God told you to do, to be a good person, to tell the truth, to love honesty, to love other people, no matter what and no matter what happens to you. Is that a psychological benefit? If God actually exists. Is it a psychological benefit if it's actually true? It's always rhetorically obvious at this point. It's like I don't even need to prove it. I just need to just lay it out there. Okay? Now what about temptations of the flesh? Here's the question. We all struggle with temptations of the flesh. Like maybe you want food and your God is your stomach and you're ruled by your appetite. Or maybe you're lazy and you want to lay down all the time. Or maybe you're tempted by sexual desires. Temptations of the flesh. If God doesn't exist, why not live for the pleasures of this world? That's called hedonism. If God doesn't exist, then what is better than those things? If God doesn't exist in Jordan Peterson's view, then the best you can do is say, well, I also want to be a good person. I also want to love people. I also want to, live this sort of life. But at the same time, that's in competition with the pleasures of the flesh. And what's going to happen is a system of compromises where in some situations you might lie just a little bit or be selfish just a little bit so that you can have a little more pleasure for yourself. But you might also give up some pleasures so you can also be a good person. Whereas if God actually exists, then no pleasure in this world can compare with the God who created all that this world has to offer. That every pleasure in this world is just a little taste of heaven. And therefore, it makes a difference with these pleasures. It puts them in their right place mentally and psychologically to know that I can enjoy them, but they never override my desire to be a good person, because ultimately, the ultimate pleasure is found in God. And all the pleasure this world has to offer is never more important than obeying God's commands to live a good life, because God is greater. He's offering me something greater than anything this world has to offer. And so I enjoy the pleasures of this world because God created it, but I know where the right place is for these things. But if God doesn't exist, then the pleasures of this life are what you worship. They're what you live for. Be a hedonist. Why not? What else do you have to live for other than this world? And so if the pleasures of this world are the best you can do, then they immediately go into direct competition with being a good person. Because you can be more selfish, you can cheat here and there, and you can get more pleasure. Alright. What about pride? Think about it this way. It's a similar situation. If God doesn't exist, then what do you live for? To be a great person, right? To have a great life. And that's going to include all your great achievements. Your great life that you live where you did all these great things. I mean, do you not want to live a great life? Do you not want to do great things? That's what you live for. That's what you worship. But what happens when you mess up? What happens when you fail? What happens when you do something wrong? Okay? Then you will never be as good a person as you could have been, as you had hoped to be, because now you've got that. And so before you did that bad thing, you had this ideal of this great person you were going to be. Now that you've done the bad thing, you can never live up to that ideal because you did do that bad thing. And the person that you could have been that never did that bad thing is clearly greater than the person who did do it. And what happens if you do a lot of bad things? That's how people wind up committing suicide, because that's one way, because their life has gone into something that they don't see, it doesn't seem to them like life's worth living anymore. It's just all messed up because they've messed up so much. But if God actually exists, then that means that you don't live to be this great person. The great thing that drives you to get out of bed in the morning and do good things is not affected by how good you live, because it's not about you. It's about worship of something greater than you. And that greater thing is not diminished or increased or changed in any way by your failures, because it's God that you live for. Or think about it this way. Here's another psychological benefit. I guess I didn't list this one from the beginning, but it's important. If God doesn't exist, then there is no thing of ultimate greatness. There is no thing of infinite value and greatness to the max. Because if you don't believe in God, then you can't have a thing of infinite wonder, infinite value, infinite awesomeness. You can't. Because as soon as something has that, then it's your God. And so whatever you live for is going to be less than that unless you start believing in God. Because as soon as you have anything that has infinite value, then you believe in God in some sense or fashion, a thing of infinite greatness, a thing of maximum worship. And so if you don't believe in God, you don't have that. So whatever you're living for, it's kind of not that awesome compared to what you have to live for, the motivation, what's great and what excites you and what amazes you is going to be more. God would be the thing of maximum greatness. That's really what it means to be God, right? A thing of maximum greatness. Now, here's the real question, and we're going to take a little more time with this last one. Does it make a difference emotionally, psychologically, and like in dealing with your inner demons or in dealing with with temptations to be evil? Does it make a difference in dealing with those things if God actually exists? So, for example, take a look at the book of Romans in the Bible. In chapter 7, Paul, who's the writer of Romans, describes a situation that we all find this situation way too familiar, way too common. He says, you know what? He says he knows what the right thing to do is. He wants to do the right thing. But he chronically and repeatedly and over again fails to do the right thing. He gets upset about failing at it. He goes out there and tries again, and just no matter how hard he tries, he keeps on and on and on and on and on doing the wrong thing. You know. Now we all recognize that like there's something messed up inside us, and it's like we all have tried really hard to be good, and like it's clear that like it's not just a matter of just trying hard. That we need to understand what's rattling around in our heads and why we're struggling inside. And why we do things that we promised. There's things that we swore that we'd never do, and then we do them. Okay? We have these sort of inner demons, these psychological problems. Now, Dr. Peterson's point of view, he would explain all this in terms of just evolution. Humanity evolved from animals and primates, and that's how, it's physical. In other words, from his perspective, all that you are as a human being is a physical object. You have no soul, no spirit. And everything that you need to do to understand your psychological state is understand that it's really the product of biochemical evolution over millions and billions of years. Okay, so, in other words, so here's the question. First of all, I want to just ask, why does Dr. Peterson, read the Bible instead of just studying evolution? In other words, he claims that, evolution is just humanity's attempt. When he says that the Bible is a book that humanity wrote about humanity's own attempt to understand our psychological state, that's really the product of evolution. Well, the question is why doesn't he just study evolution? Anyways, evolution can only explain the physical side of humanity. It can't explain the spiritual side. And it's true that we can gain insight into our human condition and our personal failings with a better understanding of our physical side. But to ignore our spiritual side is irrational, it's absurd, and it's frankly, very simply, it's just wrong. It's just clearly, provably wrong. So in other words, if you think that you have no spiritual side, that you're just purely a physical being, then there's major problems with why that's wrong. So, first of all, if you don't have a soul, then that means you don't have free will. In other words, all of your actions are determined by just chemical reactions in your head. No matter how complicated they are, there's no free will. It's just a chemical reaction. So the chemicals don't choose to react in the way they do. It's just based on their inherent physical and chemical properties in the system. They just react. So there is no choice. That means you don't really have an ability to control what you think. Like, thinking is a serious problem. From if you believe that humans are nothing but material, physical beings, what's called philosophical materialism, then thinking becomes a serious problem. So things like "I hate you" or "I love you" is I'm having a chemical reaction. Okay, so like, and that means also there's a big problem with knowing if any of your beliefs are true, because how do you know if your beliefs are true or not? You don't control what your beliefs are. You have no choice in the matter. The chemicals just reacted to cause you to believe one thing instead of believing another thing. How do you know if your beliefs are true? And even if you come up with some theory to prove, like, how you know your beliefs are true, that theory would in itself be a belief that you have that was caused by the chemical reaction. So, in other words, it's like saying, I know the chemicals reactions in my brain always tell me the truth because the chemicals told me that they always tell me the truth, which is absurd. So, hopefully you get the idea that, like, without a spiritual side, there's major problems with that. So, and you know, like in Dr. Peterson's view, and it's a view held by many, we really should just search for some sort of like injection of chemicals into people's brains, or some sort of genetic manipulation to fix when people are messed up psychologically. You know, we're just human robots. And like, you just need to go in there like fixing a car. It's just a complicated car and you understand how it works and you can fix what's wrong. You know, from his perspective, we're just biochemical machines that can malfunction and just need to be repaired. The malfunction is physical, and so from his view, the repair should also be physical. Now, that's clearly absurd. And since rationality requires us to take a spiritual view, it's not that we don't have a physicality to us, and that we, you know, even our emotional state does, and our thoughts and all that, and psychologically, we do have brains, and they are physical, and it is part of it. But to say that there's no spiritual side, that's ridiculous. So, since we have to take a spiritual view, we can do no better than to look to Christianity. And the reason is because Christianity is actually true. For proof of this, please check out my Proof God Exists playlist. Special emphasis on I have a Proof Atheism is Wrong, Morality. Check that video out. And then also the video says Proof Christianity is True. Okay. Now, the biblical view on how to overcome our inner demons and our inner sinful nature is not that we do it by sheer willpower alone. I think anyone who thinks very much at all already understands this to be true. I mean, even Dr. Peterson's talking about it in terms of like our evolutionary history. He says we've all tried our best. You know, well, no, not he doesn't say that. But my point is, what I'm saying is we've all tried our best to will ourselves to do the right thing and yet failed. Now, the biblical view is actually described quite a bit in the Bible. The biblical view is that like you can overcome your inner evil with God's help. So a good example would be in Mark chapter 6, you have the feeding of the 5,000 as sort of like an allegory for this. There's 5,000 people there, and Jesus tells the disciples to feed all these people. And the disciples say, well, we don't have enough money to buy enough food to feed all these people, and there's nowhere to buy food around here. This is ridiculous. And Jesus says to them, well, what do you have? And they're like, well, we got 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish. Okay, Jesus is like, give me that. And then Jesus miraculously transforms that into enough to feed all 5,000 people. So the idea is like, you give God everything that you have, and God does the rest. But what you have is not enough. And so in other words, God fills our needs, but you need to do your best and trust God for the rest. But our greatest needs are really internal. They're spiritual, they're emotional, they're psychological. That's our biggest struggle we have, is the struggle to overcome evil inside the human heart. Now, 1 Peter 1 talks about this some more in a less allegorical way. He says that through God's great promises, we've been given everything we need to live a godly life. And he says, therefore, because of that, therefore, make every effort to add to your faith. And he lists 7 things like virtue, self-control, perseverance, godliness, kindness. I think I missed one, but you get the idea. Oh, knowledge and love. So that's the idea. You make every effort, whatever it takes. You pray, you memorize a Bible verse, but you understand that that's not going to be enough to fix you inside. You give God your 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, and let God transform that into enough to fix the problems of the human heart. Because we can talk a lot about the evil out there and the evil that everyone does, but what about the evil inside us? Every person has to go to bed with themselves at night and know about those inner stirrings that they can't seem to get rid of. Those inner jealousies, those inner lusts, those things you've said in the middle of the night, those dark thoughts you've had. We all struggle with that. How can we be free of this evil inside us? Dr. Peterson's view is quite frankly ridiculous, because in his view, you can't be free. I mean, I don't even understand, who's going to fix you if it's just robots fixing other robots. So, what happens if all the robots break, It's just like in those zombie movies. You always wonder, what will the zombies do when everyone becomes a zombie? And why do the robots even care about fixing each other? They're just robots. They're just functioning according to their programming, and their program just arose accidentally through a long process of billions of years of evolution. What difference does it make that they evolved this way? Maybe who's to say that the machines that are malfunctioning, that's a malfunction? Says who? We're all just biochemical machines who don't even control what we think. We just function as a machine. We just operate. So you need a spiritual view, and the Christian view is the best spiritual view. So that is the end of this video. I hope this made some sense. Thank you for your time.